It began with a quiet decision made behind closed palace doors, one that few expected King Charles to approve. For years, Sandringham had been a place where family tensions were politely ignored. But this time was different. A private discussion about inheritance, access, and royal tradition reportedly ended with a stunning outcome. Camilla's sons would no longer enjoy the privileges they once expected, while Princess Anne's grandchildren suddenly found themselves welcomed into a future no one saw coming. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Reports suggest the meeting was not loud, not theatrical, and not designed for public consumption, yet its consequences were explosive. Inside the careful machinery of the palace, Sandringham had become more than a home. It had become a test of loyalty, bloodline, and royal purpose. Senior advisors were said to have raised uncomfortable questions about who should be allowed to move freely through one of the monarchy's most protected private estates. Was access a matter of affection or a matter of duty? Could the children of a queen consort stand beside descendants raised within the royal rhythm of service, sacrifice, and obligation? Those questions reportedly landed heavily on Charles, a king already carrying the burden of illness, legacy, and a family divided by years of quiet resentments. Camilla, according to whispers, did not expect the conversation to turn so sharply toward her sons, Tom Parker Bowles and Laura's side of the family circle. For years, their presence had been treated delicately, almost politely, as something no one wished to challenge too openly. But Princess Anne, iron-willed and unsentimental, was quietly consulted, and that changed the temperature of everything. Anne has always understood the monarchy as a sacred trust, not a private comfort. And if insiders are to be believed, her influence helped Charles see Sandringham not as a blended family retreat, but as a royal inheritance that had to be guarded before confusion became precedent. The decision, once spoken, reportedly stunned those closest to Camilla. Doors once assumed to remain open were suddenly being measured, reviewed, and restricted, while Anne's grandchildren were quietly positioned closer to the heart of the estate's future traditions. It was not presented as cruelty. It was presented as correction. A chilling, deliberate correction. And somewhere beneath the polished language of protocol, one message became impossible to ignore. The future of Sandringham would not be shaped by convenience, emotion, or outside expectation, but by the bloodline and duty Charles believed he was bound to protect. But this wasn't simply about who could visit Sandringham, it was about who truly belonged to the future Charles was trying to protect. To understand why this decision sent shockwaves through royal circles, one must first understand what Sandringham really represents. It is far more than a country estate. It is one of the monarchy's most cherished sanctuaries, a place where generations of royals have gathered away from public scrutiny. And according to those familiar with palace traditions, access to Sandringham has always carried a deeper meaning than the public realizes. It is not merely a place of comfort, but a symbol of belonging, continuity, and quiet approval. Within the royal world, some doors speak louder than public titles, and Sandringham has always been one of them. To be welcomed there is to be folded into the private rhythm of the crown, into a tradition guarded by habit, memory, and blood. That is why the reported decision involving Camilla's sons did not feel like a small adjustment. It felt like a line being carved into royal stone. For generations, Sandringham has been tied to family rituals that outsiders rarely fully understand. It is where royal Christmas traditions became part of the national imagination, where private loyalties were tested away from cameras, and where monarchs quietly measured who stood close to the heart of the institution. Previous generations controlled access carefully because they understood the danger of confusion. A guest could be invited, a relative could be received, but not everyone could be allowed to appear as though they belonged to the inner inheritance of the monarchy. That distinction matters, and in Charles's reign, with pressure building around health, succession, and public trust, the distinction became impossible to avoid. Camilla's sons may be family by marriage, and no one could deny their personal connection to the queen. But according to insiders, the question inside the palace was sharper and colder. Should private affection create royal expectation? Princess Anne's grandchildren, by contrast, represented a different kind of claim, not a demand, not a performance. A quiet continuation of the bloodline tied directly to the old royal order. That contrast reportedly unsettled the palace because it forced everyone to admit what had been politely avoided for years. Sandringham was never neutral ground. It was a sanctuary of monarchy, and sanctuaries have gates. Once that truth resurfaced, every invitation, every room, every future gathering began to carry meaning. Camilla's circle saw restriction. Anne's side saw restoration. Charles, caught between wife, sister, history, and duty, was left facing the hardest truth of all. A king can love his family, but he cannot let the monarchy become blurred by it. As the importance of Sandringham became impossible to ignore, attention quickly turned toward the family members whose future there suddenly appeared uncertain. For years, royal watchers noticed a delicate balancing act unfolding behind palace walls. King Charles sought harmony, Queen Camilla sought inclusion, and Princess Anne remained focused on protecting tradition. But according to various reports, those competing priorities eventually collided, creating tensions that could no longer remain hidden. What had once been softened by polite smiles and careful silence began turning into something sharper, something the palace could no longer bury beneath family language. Sandringham, the cherished retreat at the center of this storm, had become the place where every quiet disagreement suddenly carried weight. Camilla, as whispers suggest, wanted her children to remain comfortably connected to the world she had entered after decades of public struggle. To her, their presence may have represented acceptance, proof that the institution which once resisted her had finally made room not only for her crown, but for her blood. Yet Anne reportedly saw the matter differently. To the Princess Royal, royal spaces were not rewards for emotional history. They were symbols of service, guarded by generations who understood that privilege without duty could become dangerous. That difference was small at first, almost invisible. But small cracks inside palaces have a way of widening in silence. Insiders claim there were months of difficult conversations, moments where advisors raised the same question again and again. If Camilla's sons were allowed to move deeper into Sandringham's private traditions, what precedent would that set for the next reign? Would every blended branch expect the same access? Would royal property begin to look less like national legacy and more like family comfort? Charles, already pressed by illness, age, and the long shadow of succession, reportedly found himself trapped between two forces he could not easily reject. On one side stood Camilla, the woman he had fought to protect and elevate. On the other stood Anne, his sister, the tireless guardian of the old code, reminding him that the crown survives only when duty comes before sentiment. And somewhere between them stood the future. William's era approaching, Anne's grandchildren quietly representing continuity, and the public watching for any sign that royal privilege was being stretched too far. The disagreement was not explosive at first. It was colder than that. It was measured, private, and filled with the kind of restraint that makes palace conflict even more dangerous. Because when no one speaks loudly, every decision becomes louder. By the time Charles was forced to choose a direction, the issue had grown beyond Camilla's sons or Anne's grandchildren. It had become a test of royal discipline itself, a test of whether the king could still draw a hard line when that line cut through his own household. What happened next would transform a private disagreement into one of the most talked about royal decisions of the year. When the final decision reportedly arrived, even seasoned palace observers were stunned. After months of speculation and internal discussions, King Charles was said to have drawn a clear line between family affection and royal responsibility. The result left some celebrating, others frustrated, and many wondering what had forced the king's hand. According to palace whispers, the new access arrangements were not announced with drama, but delivered through the careful language of royal administration, the kind of quiet wording that changes everything without needing to shout. Sandringham's future would now be shaped more firmly around direct royal descendants, around those tied to the crown not simply by marriage, friendship, or comfort, but by the deeper burden of inheritance. For Camilla's sons, this reportedly meant a painful narrowing of privileges they may once have assumed would remain untouched. It was not described as banishment in the public sense, but inside the royal world, the effect was unmistakable. Certain invitations became less certain, certain expectations became fragile, certain doors, once softened Camilla's influence, appeared to harden under the weight of Charles's decision. Palace officials, according to insiders, began reviewing practical details with a seriousness that revealed just how far the shift might go. Guest arrangements, private access, seasonal expectations, and long-held assumptions were quietly reconsidered. Nothing was allowed to look cruel, nothing was allowed to seem reckless. But every small adjustment carried a message. Sandringham was being brought back under stricter royal discipline. And at the same time, Princess Anne's grandchildren were reportedly drawn closer to the estate's future rhythm, not through loud promotion, but through the slow, deliberate visibility that matters in monarchy. Their presence represented continuity. Their connection carried old blood, old service, old duty. That contrast placed Charles in a position that was both powerful and heartbreaking. He had spent much of his life fighting for personal acceptance, yet now, as king, he was being forced to limit personal feeling for the sake of institutional survival. The choice seemed brutal because it touched Camilla directly. It placed her motherhood against his kingship. It reminded everyone that the crown can embrace a queen consort, but it does not automatically extend the same sacred space to everyone around her. Anne's supporters reportedly saw the move as long overdue, a necessary correction before the next reign began. Camilla's allies saw something colder, a quiet humiliation wrapped in protocol. But Charles, weakened yet still aware of history pressing against him, appeared to understand the danger of delay. If he failed to define Sandringham now, others would define it later. And once royal boundaries blur, they become almost impossible to restore without pain. Yet the consequences of Charles's decision extended far beyond a single estate and reached directly into the future of the monarchy itself. Princess Anne has never been known for public celebrations. She rarely seeks headlines, rarely responds to rumors, and rarely comments on palace intrigue. Yet insiders suggest that this moment represented something she had quietly supported for years, a reaffirmation of the principles she believes have kept the monarchy strong through generations of uncertainty. For Anne, duty has never been decorative. It has never been a word used only in speeches, portraits, or polished palace statements. It is a discipline, a burden, and sometimes a weapon. That is why the reported Sandringham decision carried such force. It appeared to prove that her view of the monarchy had not faded with time, scandal, or modern pressure. While others tried to soften boundaries, Anne was said to have defended them with the calm severity of someone who understood what happens when royal privilege loses its meaning. Her relationship with Charles has always been complex but deeply rooted. She knows his weaknesses, his loyalties, his desire for peace, and the emotional price he pays when forced into conflict. Yet those close to palace circles suggest that Anne did not approach him with anger. She approached him with clarity. She reportedly reminded him that Sandringham was not simply a place of family comfort, but part of the sacred geography of the crown, tied to memory, inheritance, and the quiet expectation that those welcomed deepest into its traditions must understand service before status. That message, simple but unforgiving, seemed to echo through the final decision. Anne's grandchildren, once seen mostly as private young figures on the edge of royal attention, were suddenly discussed in a different light. Not as working royals, not as headline seekers, but as living links to a bloodline shaped by restraint rather than demand. Their increased visibility reportedly gave Anne's supporters a sense of vindication. They saw it as proof that the old values still mattered, that loyalty shown quietly over years could carry more weight than influence gained through marriage or proximity. And among the public, Anne's reputation only sharpened. Many already viewed her as the royal who kept working, while others argued, the one who carried duty without complaint, the one who never needed drama to prove her importance. This decision seemed to place her once again in the role she has quietly occupied for decades. The guardian at the gate, the steady hand when the palace risks drifting too far from its foundations. But triumph inside a royal family is rarely clean. Every victory for tradition creates a wound somewhere else. And if Anne's side saw restoration, Camilla's circle may have felt exclusion, a reminder that acceptance into the crown does not automatically erase the boundaries of blood, legacy, and future power. But while Anne's supporters viewed the decision as a victory for stability, others questioned what it meant for Camilla and the family dynamics moving forward. Few figures within modern royal history have faced as much scrutiny as Queen Camilla. And according to palace commentators, this latest development placed her in an especially difficult position. Torn between her responsibilities as queen and her role as a mother, she reportedly found herself navigating a situation with no easy solution. If she defended her sons too strongly, critics could accuse her of trying to stretch royal privilege beyond its proper limits. If she accepted the decision quietly, the silence itself could look like defeat. That was the cruel trap at the center of the Sandringham controversy. Camilla had spent years moving from outsider to consort, from scandal to crown, from public suspicion to formal acceptance. Yet this reported restriction on her sons suggested that there were still boundaries even her title could not cross. Public reaction was immediate and divided. Some argued that Charles had finally acted with necessary discipline, refusing to allow private family ties to blur the meaning of royal inheritance. Others saw the move as painfully personal, a decision that placed Camilla's children on the outside of a world their mother now sat at the center of. And between those two interpretations stood Charles, carrying the impossible burden of being both husband and king. Insiders suggest he understood Camilla's hurt, but also understood Anne's warning. The crown cannot become an open circle simply because modern family life is complicated. That was the political danger. Once non-royal family interests begin to look equal to royal bloodline traditions, every future monarch inherits confusion. Every invitation becomes a precedent. Every private arrangement becomes a public question waiting to explode. The media, sensing a family wound wrapped in institutional language, reportedly pushed the story harder. Commentators began asking whether this was a quiet humiliation for Camilla, whether Anne had gained influence at her expense, and whether Charles had finally chosen the old royal code over the blended family peace he once hoped to protect. Camilla's response remained guarded, as it often does in moments of pressure. There were no dramatic statements, no open challenge, no visible fracture. But palace watchers know that silence can be louder than anger. Behind the restraint, this decision may have forced a painful recognition. Being queen does not mean every personal tie becomes royal. Her sons could be respected, included, and loved, but that did not mean Sandringham's deepest traditions belonged to them. And that distinction, though wrapped in polite language, carried emotional force. It reminded everyone that the monarchy offers status with one hand and limitation with the other. For Camilla, the success of reaching the throne now stood against the suffering of seeing her children held at a distance from its inner sanctum, and that contrast gave the entire dispute its most human sting. As emotions continued to rise, attention increasingly shifted toward the younger generation who stood to benefit most from the new arrangement. Behind every royal decision lies a larger question. What kind of monarchy will exist 20 years from now? According to many observers, this controversy was never really about the present. It was about preparing for the future and determining which members of the next generation would carry forward the traditions of the crown. That is why the spotlight slowly began to move away from Camilla's sons and toward Princess Anne's grandchildren, not because they had demanded attention, but because their quiet presence suddenly symbolized something much larger. In a monarchy shaped by succession, timing is never accidental. Charles, standing between the reign he inherited and the reign William will one day command, reportedly understood that every decision made now could become a pattern for the future. Sandringham was not just being protected for one Christmas, one family gathering, or one private season. It was being framed as part of a long game, a careful preparation for an era where the royal family must appear smaller, stronger, and more disciplined. Anne's grandchildren, with their direct connection to a life of duty rather than spectacle, offered a different kind of message. They did not need to be promoted loudly. Their value was symbolic. They represented continuity without chaos, family without entitlement, tradition without public demand. And in that symbolism, the palace found something powerful. The public has grown increasingly curious about emerging royal figures, especially those who seem untouched by the harsher battles that have surrounded the crown in recent years. In contrast to scandals, interviews, memoirs, and family fractures, Anne's line has often appeared steady, restrained, and loyal. That restraint now seemed to matter more than ever. The reported Sandringham arrangement suggested that future belonging would not simply be based on closeness to power, but on the kind of quiet discipline the monarchy wants to project in the years ahead. Charles's decision, therefore, carried the weight of succession-era planning. It hinted that the palace was asking difficult questions before William's reign even begins. Who strengthens the institution? Who complicates it? Who carries history forward without turning it into personal advantage? These are not comfortable questions, but royal survival has rarely been comfortable. The increased emphasis on working royals and trusted family lines revealed a sharper strategy beneath the emotional drama. Sandringham's doors, once treated as symbols of private warmth, had become signals of public meaning. To be included was to be seen as part of the future. To be limited was to be reminded that affection does not equal inheritance. And as Anne's grandchildren appeared closer to that future, Camilla's sons seemed pushed toward the edge of a story they had never fully controlled. The decision did not end the debate. It exposed what the debate had always been hiding. And as the dust finally began to settle, one unavoidable truth emerged from the controversy. In the end, the debate surrounding Sandringham was never simply about property, invitations, or family preferences. It became a test of how King Charles intends to shape the monarchy during one of the most challenging periods of his reign. And the message many believe emerged from this decision was impossible to miss. Charles, after months of quiet pressure and emotional strain, appeared to reinforce a principle older than any private disagreement. The institution must come first. Not because feelings do not matter, but because the crown cannot survive if every feeling becomes policy. That was the cold truth running beneath the entire controversy. Sandringham had become a symbol, a royal stronghold where the past and future met in one difficult decision. By reportedly limiting the expectations surrounding Camilla's sons and opening greater symbolic space for Princess Anne's grandchildren, Charles sent a signal that the monarchy's private world would not be shaped only by affection, marriage, or modern family complexity. It would be shaped by continuity, service, and the careful protection of royal identity. For Anne, the moment seemed to confirm the influence she has quietly carried for decades. She did not need to command headlines or stage public battles. Her power was quieter, sharper, and more lasting. It lived in the advice whispered at the right moment, in the warning delivered without drama, in the belief that duty must remain stronger than comfort. And as her grandchildren became part of the conversation around Sandringham's future, the outline of a new royal structure began to appear, smaller, more guarded, less willing to blur the line between family connection and royal inheritance. But the cost of that structure was real. Camilla's position became more complicated, Charles's household more delicate, and the public perception of royal unity more fragile than before. Every side gained something and lost something. Anne's supporters gained reassurance. Camilla's circle faced limitation. Charles gained institutional clarity but risked private pain. That is what made the decision so powerful. It was not clean, easy, or painless. It was monarchy in its hardest form, where love and loyalty are weighed against history and duty. And perhaps that is why the story continues to echo. Because Sandringham was never just a house. It was a warning. It showed that the royal family may forgive, include, and adapt, but when legacy is threatened, the gates close, the old rules return, and the future is rewritten with ruthless calm. The battle may appear settled for now, but beneath the silence, new questions are already forming about William's reign, Anne's influence, Camilla's family, and who will truly stand closest to the crown when the next chapter begins. Because while estates can change hands and privileges can come and go, the battle over royal legacy is never truly over. It simply passes to the next generation. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.